When I look at downtown Gilroy, from say 7th Street to 1st, it's pretty much like it was in those days. It hasn't been modernized a lot.
Well, to sound like an old timer, I used to say I was born in June the 23rd, 1928. My folks lived in Gilroy. They moved here in 25. I lived here before I was born, and I lived here after I was born. But there was no hospitals here, so I went to relatives in Hollister to be born. So I was born in Hollister, but I consider myself a native Gilroyan.
It was Muriel Winter. I was born in San Jose in 1926.
I am Mildred Braquet, and I was born in Kansas, Esmond, Kansas, which is the center of the United States. And I was born in 1924.
And Barbara Jaszewski. I was actually born in Soledad, and my parents had moved. They'd come over Ellis Island and lived in Oakland for 6 years, and then moved to Soledad, and I was raised here.
My name is Al Gagliardi. I was born in San Jose, California, April 4th, 1924. And my dad was a cabinet maker in Santa Clara, and he liked to buy property. He wanted to own all of Santa Clara County. He bought property here in Gilroy, 10 acres at Farrell Avenue, and which was the old 101 highway. Two-lane road was the 101. And he bought 10 acres there in 1926, so I was 2 years old. But he had to build a house and dig a well, and then he built a big chicken house that held 2,500 chickens.
I was born in 1934 in Gilroy, California. Probably at the ranch, I'm not quite sure, or maybe at my dad had a house at that time. But yeah, I was born in Gilroy.
My name is Sig Sanchez, and I go by Sig. I was born in Hollister, California, which is a neighboring community, in 1920, so I'm 95 years old. So don't get old.
My grandfather and his wife came to California in 1883, and the only reason they could come into California at that time was the fact that he was a businessman, because they didn't allow any more Asians in, Chinese, because they had all these Chinese working on the railroads in 1850. So they were very, very particular in allowing any people from China coming in, and because Grandpa was a businessman and whatnot, he had something to add to the country of the United States, and he came into California.
We were country folks because we lived in the county, and the kids in town were the city folks. So we were a little different because we didn't have sidewalks for skates, and we didn't have streets to play ball in and stuff like that. So we had to resort to other kinds of games. And I had two brothers that were older than us, and I had a sister who was only a year and a half difference, so we were very close together. And we always played together, the normal games, jacks, kick the can, and roll the tire, swing, and things like that kept us busy. We had a lot of area to run in and play in, so we had our own fun, but we were a little different than the city kids.
And I know my brother and sister played outside a lot, and they would come, and Mother would say, "Muriel, I think it's about time for you to go outside and get some exercise." So I'd go out, and of course I was the oldest, and I'd find the kids, and what are you doing? And they'd tell me, and I'd say, oh, but don't you want to do it this way? And before you knew it, I was back in reading my book. I wasn't popular there.
My Aunt Mary, 1937, went to Gilroy High School, and she was my oldest aunt. I had two aunts, Aunt Mary and Aunt Kate. Of course, they were my favorite aunts, you know, and stuff, and they spoiled me, you know, and stuff. And she won a scholarship to go to college, and Grandpa would not let her go, because in those days, women got married and they ran a household. And I heard that, I was very sad about that.
When I went to school at Jordan School, 40 kids in a class, and so each desk raised up so you could keep your books and your other junk in there, and it had a place for your pencil and stuff, and each one had a hole for your inkwell, and so once in a while you'd dip your pen in there if you wrote with ink. You didn't do that too much. They used to teach you penmanship and stuff. Instead of people writing this way now, you're supposed to move your hand like that. So you had the writing. Your writing was very artistic back then.
Junior high was very interesting. You know, I didn't begin to realize until, probably about the 4th or 5th grade or 6th grade that I was different, okay? I was Chinese American. Now, I'll be very honest with you. I'd be less than honest with you if I didn't tell you this. I'd get called names and so forth, and it was difficult. It bothered me, but it didn't bother me to the point of not going to school, all right? And I remember one of the things that used to bother me in the 6th grade or something like this is, and I'm sure you remember some of this, they put a little envelope, but they have a little party on your desk, and you get invited to parties. Well, in the 5th and 6th grade, I really got invited to a party. And then when I got invited to a party, it was with a person that lived out in a ranch near us. His name was Jack Lillard, and I remember him very well. And I remember him well because he invited me to his party, first of all. And from then on, it began to change. And part of the change, I think, was, you know, I was smart and get chosen for math, get chosen for this in class. But going into the 7th grade, I was very athletic. And 8th grade, I was a very good athlete. And things changed.
When I was 12 years old, I started delivering the Mercury newspaper. We used to take the papers, you'd fold them twice, you fold them under and you'd box them. And they were square like this, and you had a rack on the side of your bike, or you had a thing, and you would throw them like I don't know, maybe like a frisbee or something, and you'd sail them all the way up on the porch. It was an honor to get the paper on the porch. Sometimes you'd throw them a little hard, and they'd get a wind thing, and they'd go up on the roof. That wasn't any good. You'd have to call the people and say, hey, your paper's up on the roof.
Also, the other thing that was so interesting, and anybody that lives in the country can tell you the same thing, when the phone rang in the country, our number was 1052J, and you'd go answer it, and you'd hear click, click, click. We were the 13th person on the line. So everybody, I don't think anybody came on after us, so we'd hear 12 clicks down the line, everybody listening in on the conversation on the farmer's line. It was very amusing.
And iceman delivered the ice every once a week. And he would come in. Well, in those days we didn't even lock the house. We didn't have a key. You know, you talk to these people and say, they didn't have to lock their house. The old days, we got so many thieves. I said, we didn't have nothing to steal. Well, people wouldn't come in our house for. And the iceman would just come in through the door and put the ice. He gave us a sign, and it would say 25, 50, 75, 100, and it depends how you hung it. If you hung it, said 50, he left 50 pounds. Hung at 20, he left 25 pounds. I don't know how they paid him, and my sister and I, when he came, because ice, we never had any ice, because Mama said you can't have ice, because you gotta last all week. And I guess this guy would feel sorry for two little shrimps there. And once in a while he'd crack a little piece of ice out and give us a little, oh man, we thought we were in heaven, with a little piece of ice.
We were heavily into prune growing, in Gilroy. We were larger than the northern part of the state is now in growing prunes. But it got to the point, I well remember when the first development came up, because beyond the cemeteries, behind them there was a prune ranch that was about 40 acres, and then there was a cherry orchard that was about 80 acres, and then another prune ranch on the end of it. Because
of frost, we had to use smudge pots, and the smudge pots were put out in the orchard with oil in them, diesel, or, well, it was kind of a diesel. They called it coal oil. And my father would have listen to the radio when it was going to be a frost tonight. And when it was, well, then my brothers would have to get up and you get a torch, and you have to take the lid out of this smudge pot, and you run down there and light each one of them all the way through the orchard, and you got heat generating, moving the air, and that would keep the blossom from being frozen. When we went to school in the morning, we caught the bus there right on 101 Highway, which is Monterey Highway now, Monterey Road. We caught the bus, and you could tell it was a big frost, because when you looked to San Jose, it was just black smoke in the air, talking about smog. We had it in those days, but nobody knew that it was bad.
There were 3 sons before we had a sister. My younger brother and I had the chore of milking the cows, and my older brother wouldn't touch them, and he wouldn't feed them for us, and he wouldn't milk them for us. So we had the chore of having to do our own work. So we learned from having responsibility.
Taking care of the chickens and feeding them, gathering the eggs. You had to candle them, you had to clean them and weigh them, put them in the crates, 30 dozen in a crate or 15 dozen in a half crate. And we shipped them through poultry producers. That's why we used to see Pop Balfing. He was running poultry producers downtown, and we delivered them. But we also sold eggs on the out of our front of our house there on the highway. And the chickens, we sold chickens too there.
When I was in high school, my freshman year, I just went to school half a day in the beginning in September, because I went to on Miller Avenue with my dad to pick grapes, because the crop was still not completed. And then also I picked a lot of prunes. That was horrendous. I cut a lot of apricots, but I enjoyed cutting apricots. We used to cut apricots for the Conrados that live out in the Hecker Pass. They had those moorpocks, which are big apricots. They were fun. I cut pears. Picking prunes was the worst. The rest were okay, and I still to this day could pick grapes and enjoy it. It was just fun, yeah.
We were planting tomatoes because we used to work as a family. And in those days, you dug the hole, you poured a bucket of water in, you put the plant in, and you did it like you do in the garden. And my mother was working with us, and my dad was working with us, and my dad said, boys, I got to take your mother to town. And what do you think she went to town for? My dad came back and said, you boys have a little sister.
We had a pantry. And you see in the pantry, my dad built one. And you built up this cabinet about so wide, and it has some little screen on it. And then on the floor, you put a hole and put a screen. So you're getting the cold air put into the house. So we could keep like cheese and salami, and we never bought butter. We had to buy, you know, which was called Nuco then, and keep things like that, but you couldn't keep meat. We had to get an ice box to keep the meat in, see.
Mother was a great cook, and I can remember coming home from school and smelling the tomatoes that she had just canned. And I said, could I have one of those jars of tomatoes? And she'd say, well, here, you can have this. So I took the lid off, and then I sat down and just consumed the whole jar because it was so good. It tasted like it smelled.
You know, it was tough times during the Depression, and we used the bread, and we scraped every bit of gravy off of that plate or whatever it was, and made sure it was clean. And as two little runts, you know, we'd say, Mama, look at, you don't have to wash the dish, and Mama would say, no, we got it. I said, look, but Mama, look, I mean, the fishes. And we always thought, I don't know why she has to wash it, but okay. You know, that's how a little kid thinks, you know.
And we were such a large family that, in fact, my dad built the house that we lived in. We didn't have any electricity for years after we moved into the house. In fact, we belonged to a 4-H club, and that was a project for the 4-H club. We did the electrical work in the house that we lived in. So we did for ourselves. We were self-sufficient.
We moved on 8th Street, which was by the railroad track, and the freight train would come from Salinas with the lettuce, but it would stop at the depot. This is one thing that I've never forgotten. And this was Depression days. This was starvation, and I'm talking about when I was 10 years old. When the train would stop, the kids in the block, we'd all go running with our salt shakers, because a lot of head lettuces would fall off the train and the freight cars, and we'd eat that like an apple with our salt. Oh, that was such a treat. This is starvation. And the other thing we would do too, hot weather, the paving, the tar on the streets was soft, and we'd scrape that up and chew it for gum. Once in a while we'd get a piece of rock. And then we lived close to the Victory Market, which was run by Henry Kong. And my mother would send me there with a dime, and I can remember they'd fill a bag with enough vegetables for a bowl of soup, like they'd get a stalk of celery and stuff like that. And then once in a while, for a big treat, the butcher would give me a weenie, and I certainly engulfed that in a hurry before I even got home.
We were fortunate because we didn't have to go to a soup line like a lot of the big cities, you know. Didn't have any food. But we always had vegetable garden, and we always had spaghetti, and we always had chicken, and of course we had some rabbits too. So it was surprising. I was surprised myself as a young child, because my godmother lived in Oakland, and she came down quite often with my godfather and Aunt Susie, and they'd come down just unexpected, and Mama would have a big meal on the table. I couldn't understand how we could get such a big meal. But boy, they'd bake bread, and they'd get the spaghetti out, and first thing you know, there was a salad and all this stuff, and chicken cooking, and everybody working. And so, you know, we never starved, and we had a sufficient amount of food, but we never had any money. My sister and I could never buy an ice cream cone or soda water, you know.
Going to high school, what's vividly in my mind, to this day I can still taste it. There was a little house in the back of the high school in Swanson Lane, and for a dime, once a week, that was my allowance. I had a hamburger. It was paper thin, but it had a pickle on it and mustard, that was it, and an ice cream for a dime. But to this day, I can't eat a thick hamburger. I want my hamburgers thin. I can still taste them. So crazy is that?
We wore rayon hose. They just weren't as pretty, and they weren't as nice looking on our legs. But that's all there was available for us, actually. Or we went bare-legged with colored cream and wore it.
Little things meant so much those days, though, and I really think, in a way, I'm blessed that I appreciate everything so much. I appreciate every day, my friends, because it was so tough, and I know what it is like to sacrifice and go without, and you just enjoy every day. You know, your cup is always half full.
All the city only consists from probably 1st Street, where the Catholic Church was, all the way to about 8th Street or 9th. That was it. Just one street of businesses, and that was it. So it was very small.
It was a very small community, very harmonious, everybody. The Elks Club was the focal point for entertainment, and but of course today it's over 50,000 people. It's a completely new community.
One of the wonderful things was when we would come into town to shop, we'd shop at the Red and White Grocery, where Ormond Rector was a good friend of my folks, and he owned the grocery store, so we went in there. Then we'd go next door to Heck and Band. I don't know if anybody remembers them, but that was the butcher shop, and he always had a piece of bologna that he handed over the counter, you know. Here I was down here.
There was a purity store that was on 4th and Eaglebury Street, and it was, they all over, they had the same design. It was a curve. Whatever town you went, you knew it was a purity store by the shape of the building. Later on, it became Jim's Sports Shop for long years.
Well, I remember 5 and 10, and of course, as you grow up, Shillings, you know, Shillings was a big old hangout for teenage kids. And when you're a little kid, you looked at that and you said, wow, someday when we'll go in there and sit around there and look around, and you see all these teenagers, and it says, when we become teenagers, we're going to come in there. And they had these jukebox things on the table, and you could put money in it and you could play and the record would come up. But then when we were earlier, there was a place called Wences, and Wences was a drugstore, and Wences had this little counter, and we go there and get a Coke or something. And I remember they had this real pretty girl, and she was a high school girl, and we were young teenage kids, and we go there and get a Coke from her just to talk to her.
Former Mayor George Milius, which I'm sure you've all heard of, he played a very important role in the city of Gilroy. He was the mayor for a long time. In fact, I followed him as mayor after he retired. He was active. He owned the hotel. It was kind of a stopping place for many of the state politicians when they went through Gilroy. The hotel was a place where, like Goody Knight, who was governor, and some of the politicians from Sacramento. He was well known in political circles in those days, so it was good for his business. Plus, he got to know a lot of people. Politically, he did very well.
Mostly there was no parking at all. You just parked on the main street. All the stores closed on Sunday, and it was interesting because people would drive downtown and park on the main street. They'd sit in the car, or they'd walk up and down the street, and they'd greet each other. They'd talk to people. People might get in the back seat of the car, so they'd talk for a while. And I thought that was neat, you know. Of course, all the houses, you know, had porches, and people used to walk a lot. So you knew everybody in town.
And then I worked at Woolworths when I graduated from high school in '38. And I was going north on Sam's Cafe, which was a restaurant across from the Strand Theater. And this really good-looking man, he had to be about 6'2" or 6'3", came out and got into the convertible there. He had eaten at Sam's. And I said, "Are you John Payne?" As an old-time, good-looking movie star. And he says, "That's right." And he drove off, and it was on my break. I ran back to the store, forget the break, because you used to have those cheap frames with movie stars until I found his picture. I don't think I knew what I was doing the rest of the day. I was so excited.
And then when I got to be about 10 years old, 10 or 11, Mama would let me and Al Mosso, who was a neighbor about a quarter of a mile away from us, and we walked to the Strand Theater to see the movies. So that's when I was a little bigger, you know.
I worked in the theater when I first started in high school. So I must have been 15. I just seated people or worked at the window, sell tickets. Wherever they needed me, that's where you worked that day.
From there, we moved over to the Strand Theater. It was the Masonic building, and the theater was there. I have a picture of it. And at that time, the ticket booth wasn't in the center, it was over to the side, and it went into our store. And there was 2 picture windows on either side of the ticket booth, and where you could look into the store when you're waiting in line. And then on the other side was Schilling's candy store, and it had a door that went from their store into the entrance of the theater.
I went to the movies, not till I was living in town, and I cut a lawn, and you get 16 cents, and 16 cents will get you in the movies, and maybe another few cents will get you another nickel or two, get you a bag of popcorn, and you go to the movies on Saturdays. And I remember going with my friends, and we sit down in the lower part, and then when the movie would start, we'd run up to the loges, because the ushers would be all gone, and we sit up in the loges and think we were big shots and sitting there and watching the movie from up there.
And then the Strand Theater, we would go, my cousin used to come here from Oakland, spend a week with me, and we'd go Saturday to the show. And I can remember seeing Tarzan, and we stayed to see the picture twice, and my mother got worried and sent somebody to look for us. But then we had so much fun playing Tarzan at home. But I always had to be Tarzan, and she always insisted on being Jane. I never got to be Jane, but anyhow.
And movies, I think I saw every Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy movie that was ever made. I remember seeing color for the first time in Trail of the Lonesome Pine. It was in black and white all the way through the movie, and then at the end there was this brilliant color, and it just lit up the screen, you know. It was so much fun.
Well, it was still owned by Jack Peters' father. He owned the Strand Theater, or he might have bought it. I don't know who owned it. It was a guy by the name of Smeltzer who was operating it, but I think he was just the operator.
Later on, Jack Peters we did a lot of work for Jack Peters. We did the neon, we did a lot of neon in his canopy that came out and so forth, and we had to shorten it because the highway came through. At one time, it came out further, and if you see pictures of the old Strand Theater, the front of it is flat because we had to chop part of it off and re-put new neon to run around it.
So we went to town to go to the movie, and it was a special movie, and the movie was 25 cents, not a dime. We didn't have the 25 cents to go to the movie, so we ended up going next door to the creamery and getting our treat was an Eskimo pie. So we didn't go to movies quite often. We really didn't have the resources. But we were happy.
And we always stayed for the news, because in those days, you didn't have television, you know? And so we're interested in sports primarily, so we would go and stay through the news, watch the news to see what's happening in the world, and only things that interest you as a teenager, of course. and they show sports after. You have a clip of sports where they show the Army-Navy game or the Notre Dame playing somebody, just the big schools, and you sit and watch that. You know, the movies were great because it gave you an opportunity to see parts of the world. At that age you wouldn't. But then again, they could have done a better job too. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, you know.
My husband went into the service on the 8th day of December in 1941. We were attacked on the 7th of 41. So many of our young men went up the next day to enlist in the service.
Well, I went to the Pacific. I wanted to go to Europe. I would have liked to got to Italy or France, where there would have been a lot of nice girls, but I got to Pacific, where there was every island I went on, they hated me. They shot at me.
One of his friends went to the Navy. One of the boys that went from Gilroy up there that day, they were taking in and standing in line in front of anyone that had the shortest line, whether they went Navy or Air Force or Army or Marines. And then most of them were gone a full 5 years.
I was about 13 when World War II started, and you couldn't get clocks and things like that. So I used to go in and fix the clock, the alarm clocks, and I'd get $1 to fix a clock.
I don't know how to say this, but college wasn't what it was cracked up to be, because the war was on and there were 7 women to 1 man, and those men weren't really that much fun. You know, I think of them now, and I think they may have either not gone into the service before. Maybe they were 4F or something like that, and I don't think they were happy about it. I think they wished they could have joined their brothers.
And everything was rationed. Foodstuffs were rationed, and shoes were rationed, and nylons were impossible to have. Meats, butter and sugar, flour, everything the military needed was rationed.
Sugar was hard to get. You gradually were issued tickets of a kind, of a sort, to trade in at the grocery store along with your money.
So, like even costume jewelry back then, you couldn't make it out of brass or whatever, and plated, so they made it out of sterling silver. Your cheap stuff was sterling silver.
Butter was taken off the market because it was margarine. It was margarine, and margarine was white, and it had a little packet of something red in there, some little powder, and you put it in a bowl and mixed it to create it so it looked like butter.
Our class had no album. We graduated in the middle of the afternoon because we couldn't have lights on. Everything along the coast was blacked out. You couldn't have any open windows. And you will find if they had a second time to come by and see that there was not blackout shades in the house.
I came to Gilroy in 1943 when President Roosevelt evacuated the Japanese communities during the war and took over a farm where the outlets are now. That was in 1943. I met my wife, Jane. We were married. Initially, we were supposed to move to Hollister, but of course all the important decisions are made by the women, so we ended up in Gilroy. Gilroy's been our home.
Yeah, I had some Japanese, a couple of Japanese friends that I knew of and whatnot. And the Japanese friend that I met had a ranch. They had a small ranch next to my grandfather's ranch. And I met him, and we used to go fishing and go down the creek and shoot BB guns and stuff like that together and things like that. And my friends would ride their bikes down, and we all go down to the creek and stuff and play around the farm. Yeah, and I did meet him, and it was very sad. I remember my grandmother was extremely sad because the Japanese young man's mother and grandmother lived in the same house, and they were good friends with my grandparents and whatnot, and they were taken off the count.
There just didn't seem to be any reason for them to be. It was in our senior year, and so they didn't graduate with us. And my husband felt that way too. He had some very good friends.
And they were there for a year, I believe, after the war was over, before they were brought back here and were able to get their land all back from people that had taken care of it while they were gone.
Most of the Japanese people all came back and started all over again. They were good people. They were good farmers. They did great. They did a great recovery. They were good community people.
I came home in January, about 3rd of 1946, after the war.
And of course, then after World War II, things changed because, you had Rosie the Riveter and all that, so women started doing everything. And now you look back at the way the men used to run track. Now the women run faster, jump higher, and jump longer than the men used to back in the 20s. Of course, they always worked harder.
I spent 50 years in public service. I think the one thing that I accomplished that probably gave me the most recognition was I was responsible for getting the freeway constructed. In those days, we had to go, if you were going to San Jose, you went up Monterey Highway. And it was a very dangerous route because it had 3 lanes. I don't know who engineered this project, but it was 3 lanes, 1 lane each way, and the passing lane was the middle lane. Can you imagine? And we were killing people by the dozen, so I took it upon myself. I was just leaving the mayorship, and I was on the board of supervisors and decided that would be one of the projects that I would lead. And of course, when you're in public service, you don't take all the credit for everything that's done because you need a lot of other people to be part of it.
I was involved with the veterans since I'd come out of there. I became commander, and we'd had a lot of dealing with Mr. Warner, I think his name was, he was city editor, and he had a lot of power. And one day we were in there because we had to go see him to get anything done, because, politics. And he said, Sheriff's going to be opening a substation here. You guys should go and apply. Well, he influenced me. I went up there and I got a job. I was a patrolman, investigate crime, take reports. we had different sections, but we had some jailers. We had to work in the jail once in a while, but most of the time I was outside and I had a beat. I worked this beat here in Gilroy for about 6 or 7 years.
My husband had met Rich Conrado from Gilroy in the service back in Mindanao, and talking, and they realized, you know, what we had they had in common there. So they had said, if they got out of this alive, they were going to go in business together. So this opportunity came up with the Gilroy Food Products, which was the ravioli factory that Andrew Chinchero owned, and we bought it from him with Rich. So we were there until 8 years. And this offer came up at the Pollyanna Bakery. Well, it wasn't quite enough in our business as our family's growing for our partnership. So we decided to buy the bakery and wanted Rich to come with us. We'd combine a delicatessen and a bakery. Well, boy, little did we know, thank God he didn't want to do it, because it was all we could do to keep the bakery going, because that was hard. My husband would go to work at midnight and 2 in the morning. He'd work 18 hours a day. I'd work 12, 14 hours a day. And I don't know what I would have done without my mother and dad helping me take care of the children. I mean, you know. So then we stayed there for 10 years. That was from 1950 to 60.
My husband, Muriel Brem, well, he eventually became postmaster of Gilroy for about 32 years. He was one of 5 that Harry Truman made postmasters, because Roosevelt had been president for so long, and in those days, the postmaster was politically appointed.
And television didn't come until we were in high school. I remember the first television set, we're walking home from high school and whatnot, and Halls on the corner had a clothing store, and then a store or two over, he had an appliance store. Well, here was this TV with a screen about this big, and there was probably like 10 of us circled around. There was a football game, and we couldn't believe it. You could see it on the screen, and it was just absolutely amazing, you know.
We didn't get a television until my son was 6 years old. And he was born in 45. So that was our first television, and it was black and white.
I was a hotshot. I had a television. People like Art Bannister and Bob Byers and Warren Byers came over and to my house and watched the Rose Bowl or the Super Bowl. So I had a lot of friends because I had that was in the 50s.
We didn't have television until 50s. We bought my folks one in the 40s, late 40s, because we figured they're older, we couldn't afford it for ourselves, but we did buy them one. Then when we built our house, Dil and Ernie Felice lived next door to us. Our TV for a couple of years was Jackie Gleason, but looking at it through our bedroom window into Dil and Ernie's living room window, lip reading. Can you imagine?
If people get exposed to discussions, for example, like you're making available, myself and these others, you should expose young people to these kind of history. They're not important, they're not any big legacy, but people can learn from them. From the fact that we did this or we did that. Not that it was all good, but at least they can compare what it was like in those days compared to what it is today. So I think it would be good.
You know, I like to comment that because of the age difference, there's always that little animosity. The young kids saying, oh, old guys, they'll never change. And the old people saying, darn kids, world's coming to an end, and I don't believe that. And I say this to the youth of today, they're the best we can produce. They are. To them, the torch is passed, just like it was to us. They are going to be our next leaders. And I challenge them with great expectation when I ask them, build a better mousetrap, please. God bless.